Republican Lindsey Graham of South Carolina and Independent Bernie Sanders of Vermont. Gentlemen, welcome both.
Good to be with you, George.
And Senator Sanders, let me begin with you. We've seen the details of this strategy leak out over the last several days. It sounds like President Obama is set to announce about 30,000 new U.S. troops for Afghanistan, supplemented by about 5,000 or 6,000 NATO forces if they can get them. That appears to give General McChrystal most of what he asked for. Can you support it?
I've got real concerns with that, George. You know, you got to put Afghanistan into the context of what's happening in America today. And what's happening now is not only a $12 trillion national debt, we're in the midst of the worst economic recession since the Great Depression of the 1930s. The middle class is collapsing. The gap between the rich and the poor is growing wider. Piece in the paper today, 1 out of 4 kids in this country are on food stamps, 1 out of 8 Americans. And when we go Christmas shopping, we're going to be buying our products from China, who are lending us money to fight the war in Afghanistan. So I've got a real problem about expanding this war where the rest of the world is sitting around and saying, isn't it a nice thing that the taxpayers of the United States and the U.S. military are doing the work that the rest of the world should be doing? So what I want to see is some real international cooperation, not just from Europe, but from Russia and from China, because what happens in Afghanistan impacts what happens in Pakistan. That is enormously important. The world should be involved.
But you know the Russians aren't going to be going back into Afghanistan, so does that mean you're not going to support this?
I have a real problem supporting 30 or 40,000 more troops and $100 billion more a year for that war on top of what we're spending in Iraq.
Senator Graham?
Well, I'd like to hear the details from the President Tuesday, but I would support an increase in troops for the reasons that Bernie just kind of indicated about Pakistan. The whole world is watching what we're doing there. The Iranians are threatening to withdraw from talks regarding their nuclear program, and we'll be evaluated by some pretty tough characters in the world as to how we handle Afghanistan. This is not just any place on the planet. This is the place where the Taliban took control after the Russians left, aligned themselves with al-Qaeda, and attacked this nation and killed 3,000 Americans. And I hope the President will tell the world, our troops, and anybody listening Tuesday, that will never happen again with this new surge of forces. Taliban will never take back over Afghanistan. We're going to put measurements and benchmarks on the Afghan government, but we're going to have the troops in Afghanistan to win the conflict. I hope he says that without in any uncertain terms.
But Senator, how about this question of cost that Senator Sanders raised? It looks like the cost is going to be about $1 million per year for each additional service members. And a lot of Democrats, like the chairman of the House Appropriations Committee, David Obey, talked to our John Carl this week, said we ought to pay for it. Take a listen.
If we have to pay for the health care bill, we should pay for the war as well.
How?
By having a war surtax. The problem in this country with this issue is that the only people who've been asked to sacrifice are military families.
Does he have a point there, Senator Graham? If we're going to fight a war, shouldn't the American people pay for it?
Well, I'd like to have an endeavor to see if we can cut current spending and find some dollars that we're spending today to pay for the war and prioritize America's spending. Where does our national security rate in terms of spending? Are there things that we can do in the stimulus package? Can we trim up the health care bill and other big ticket items to pay for a war that we can't afford to lose? So I welcome a debate about how to control government spending and pay for the war. I do want to let Bernie and anyone else listening know that from my point of view, the President is correct in assessing that Afghanistan is a war that must be won because the national security implications of what happens in Afghanistan will follow this country for decades. So I intend to support the President.
I want to have Senator Sanders come in on this, but first let me press you on that. Let me first get Senator Graham on one point there. So you're against the tax, but you are for cutting spending to pay for this, not increasing the deficit, Senator Graham?
Yeah, I think it'd be a good exercise for the Congress to look at ways to trim up the spending, which has been out of control since the administration came into power, and prioritize this war the way it should be. Our national security future depends on getting it right in Afghanistan, and there's no better use of taxpayer dollars than to defend America, in my view.
Senator Sanders?
Well, let's see. We spent perhaps $2 or $3 trillion in the war in Iraq that Bush got us into that we never should have been in, which we didn't pay. We sent that bill to our kids and our grandchildren, And what Senator Graham is now saying, as I understand it, is, hey, we can cut back on education so middle-class families can't afford to send their kids to college. We don't have to rebuild our infrastructure. We don't have to invest in sustainable energy, so we stop importing $350 billion a year of foreign oil. We don't have to do all that stuff. Let's just spend more money in Afghanistan while Europe and the people of China and the people of Russia watch us do that work. I think that is a very poor set of national priorities.
So, Senator Sanders, if I hear you correctly, if you're against, or if you have a big problem with sending more troops, does that also mean that you're against this surtax that Congressman Obey is talking about in order to pay for the troops?
Well, look, we have a presence in Afghanistan now. No one is talking about bringing the troops home tomorrow. What we need is more international cooperation. We need an Afghan government that resonates with its people, that is not corrupt. But if you're going to have a presence there, you just can't pass the bill on, as we did in Iraq, to our kids and our grandchildren. I think that's wrong. I think that's immoral.